Welcome to Dead Giveaway, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of playing giving. I'm your host, Matt Treadwell. Join me as I sit down with inspiring professionals who are shaping legacies and making a lasting impact, one gift at a time. Let's dig in.
I'm Craig Wruck. I am in Rochester, Minnesota. I am retired, but I serve as senior advisor for PG Calc, which is a somewhat more than part-time endeavor these days.
How did you get into philanthropy?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and a lot of different paths converged. You know, they talk about a circuitous route. I think I'm proof of that. Um, I grew up in what I think today we would probably call a low to moderate income household. I was first in my family to go to college, let alone graduate. And I was a high school student and an undergraduate during the height of the anti-war movement. So activism, our responsibility to speak up for those who may not have a voice of their own has always been really important to me. I've always been involved in community organizing of one sort or another. I think collective action is how things get done. I can remember in undergraduate school, one of the textbooks in a political science course was Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals. And the professor was surprised that I could recite entire passages of it from memory. So I've always been sort of an activist. I've always been interested in others. My undergraduate degree is in journalism, and my big plan was to make documentary films. That didn't work out. Took me a while to figure out that there's not a broad market for documentaries, and Hollywood is as much about contacts and networking as it is about skill and determination. So after bouncing around in a couple of different newspaper jobs, I wound up at the Claremont University Center in Southern California as a prospect researcher. It seemed pretty logical to me, a journalist and an aspiring documentarian doing prospect research. That was 1975, the Tax Act of 69, which created most of modern plan giving. Those regulations had just been finalized. And management at Claremont realized somebody on staff better figure out how this stuff worked. I didn't have much seniority. In fact, I was the low man, and so I drew the short straw. Nobody else wanted to go listen to a lawyer talk about taxes in some windowless conference room downtown for a week. So I wound up being exposed to Conrad Teitel's Philanthropy Tax Institute, and it was just a total epiphany. Suddenly, fundraising was no longer just about finding rich people and asking them for money. I had all of these wonderful tools. I could engage generous people and help them meld some of their financial and tax interests with their philanthropic interests. It was actually pretty hard to believe that it was true. I had just been married at the time. I remember going home to my wife and explaining to her how charitable remainder trust worked according to Conrad Teitel. And she assured me I would go to jail if I recommended to people that they do such things. That was the beginning. It was quite by accident. I'd love to tell you that I woke up one day and decided I wanted to be a plan giving officer, but that's not the way it worked.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that experience? Charitable remainder trust was what kind of struck the nerve with you, or was it more to it than that?
It was broader than that. Conrad is still around and still lectures from time to time. He's just got a wonderfully engaging way of explaining these complex vehicles in ways that you can understand. The whole idea that somebody could split their interests and give part of the interest to the charity and retain the interest for themselves just really struck a chord for me. And up until that time, as a prospect researcher, I was trying to find rich people that the major gift officers could go, knock over for a contribution. Now there was something else that they could talk to them about. Conrad was one of my early mentors. The guy was just amazing in the comfortable way that he could explain these things. Words that I first heard Conrad speak, I have repeated to donors throughout the years. I mean, I'd like to flatter myself and think that my own teaching style is a bit like Conrad's. There's a little bit of humor, there's enough of a war story to it that it makes it memorable, but mostly it's being able to explain these complex things in ways that are accessible to mere mortals, to just donors, to people who are not experts.
I'm curious though, when you made the switch from prospect research to legacy giving, gift planning. How did you make that happen? Or was it because you were the one that went to this talk that now you were de facto the expert?
Yeah, it really was a vacuum. There was a bit of a vacuum that I fell into. Listeners may not be familiar with the Claremont colleges. There are 5 or 6 colleges at Claremont. The University Center is now the graduate school at Claremont, and there were 5 undergraduate colleges. The oldest among them is Pomona College, and Pomona's always been a leader in plan giving, and so there was a tendency, this goes back a number of years, for the other colleges to sort of stand back because Pomona had already been there and done that. So there was a vacuum. I don't want to say I was sucked into plan giving, but there was a vacuum and I filled it.
So how did you find that transition, that career growth when you go from prospect researching to now, I'm guessing, frontline fundraising? How did you adapt? How did you adjust?
Good question, but not without some friction along the way. My background in journalism, I'm much more comfortable asking questions and listening, waiting for people to answer. The major gift officers, my colleagues in that department, at the time were much more sales oriented, and that's not my nature. So we would share stories of, once we'd returned from a road trip and they were talking about the good hard pitch they had made and how they had closed, and they closed 3 times before the donor finally said yes. And I was telling stories I had learned about, somebody's life story and how they had gotten to be there, and it ended up becoming a planned gift, but it was like speaking a foreign language. I'm not sure I could ever have succeeded in a major gift role, and I think it would have been mighty difficult, at least at that time, to transition from that hard-hitting, transaction-oriented major gift work to the plan giving side.
So it was actually a benefit to go from prospect researching to plan giving without the major gift.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. The other thing I think, and I've talked to John Krause at University of Denver. John Krause and I have talked about um, introverts and I'm an introvert. I absolutely am.
Mm.
And how maybe introverts make better plan giving officers than extroverts
Interesting.
because our nature is to be quiet and to listen.
So was it easy to take that? What are you, donor, interested in doing, and putting that out there and letting the silence fill the gaps, and then letting the donor kind of do that uncomfortable, I need the answer now because it's silent?
Yeah, I think so. Going back to my early colleagues in major giving, they would play that game. There's a sales game where the next one to speak loses. I don't mean it that way. Car salesmen do this all the time, right? Um, it's not that. It's that as an introvert, I'm totally comfortable with silence. And if you ask a question and then just give the donor time to pull their thoughts together and listen to them, and everything about you needs to say that you're listening to them, they will tell you maybe more than they even knew themselves. And one of my favorite questions to ask a donor, and it takes a while to get there. You don't blurt this out as soon as they invite you in the front door. But one of my favorite questions to ask a donor is what would you like to do with your money that would be meaningful to you? It's a very simple question. And then just stop and listen. And they will tell you things that sometimes are really heart-wrenching. And then it's a matter of looking for, can I match that passion to a need for my institution? And, then we're off to creating a gift plan. This was a transgender individual that I've been working with. Fascinating individual. When she came to the office in a dress, her name was Joyce. When she came to the office in a suit and tie, her name was James. And the staff was totally cool with that. And I had adopted that. But she had gone through the transition and she was Joyce. And finally, one day I asked Joyce that question. I said, what would you like to do with your money that would be meaningful to you? And there was this long silence. And then she said, well, once we're done here today, I have to go up north to pick up my 2 children. She had long since been divorced, my 2 children from summer camp, and drive them home. But because of the court order, I'm going to have to change clothes because only James is allowed to pick up those children. And what I would like to do is make sure nobody ever has to do that again. And I just thought, wow. And she wound up making some pretty significant gifts to a program in human sexuality for the university I was working for. But those were the kinds of, I don't think you wouldn't get there if I came in saying, here's the program in human sexuality, here's all the great work that we're doing, and now it's time for you to think about your gift. We would never, we would never have reached that level in that conversation.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is interesting about what you just said is you also have to be open to, I think, donors saying that they want their gift to go somewhere else. Because what if it was something that you couldn't handle or do?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a real ethical concern because we're all under pressure to meet goals. And, there's next quarter and there's the fiscal year end. But yes, there are times when the right answer is not my institution. Let me help you find your way to an institution that could do that.
Have you had to do that throughout the course of your career?
Yeah, I have.
And how do you handle that with your organization? Because not all organizations are fine with it. I just put in a contact report where I connected one of my donors to another institution, and I'm waiting for the call saying, "Why did you do this?" And it's like, because this is what the donor wanted. And I know a lot of what we do is donor relations. So I'm always curious how other organizations and other people have handled that situation.
Yeah, I think you just said not every organization is okay with that. I would say most organizations are not okay with that. In the long run, I think the world's a better place. And so I'm gonna stick to it. What's the alternative? You're gonna twist arms and force people to make gifts that they don't really want to make, and the institution is gonna wind up with donor expectations that they really can't fulfill. And ultimately, you could wind up in court with bad press, so it just isn't worth it.
Going back, you said that you had Conrad as a mentor. Was he your only mentor at the time, or did you have other mentors? How did that work?
No, he wasn't the only one by any means, but he was the first. Just his way of explaining things and merging good humor, I remain in awe of it. I think another lucky break about 3 years after I had my first experience with Conrad, I applied for a grant from the Northwest Area Foundation. This goes back again to the late 70s. Northwest Area Foundation is the James J. Hill family fortune. And at that time, Northwest Area Foundation was seeding plan giving programs in the upper Northwest. Their idea was by making a grant to fund a plan giving officer to start a plan giving program, they could in fact create much more impact in terms of dollars and endowment than they could by direct grants. So they had this program where they would start up plan giving programs. And I was fortunate enough to get a grant, which is why I moved from Los Angeles to Minnesota. I was also fortunate that my grant was late in the cycle, so I didn't quite fit in the regular cohort. So I didn't have the benefit of the group training that was part of their program. So I wound up with a lot of one-on-one training with a fellow named Harvey DeVries. Harvey has been dead for probably 20 years now, but he was a college fundraiser and a minister before that. And Harvey was a great technician. He knew the stuff up and down, inside and out. But one of the things Harvey preached, literally preached, was the risk of becoming enchanted by the instruments of plan giving. So we need to remember always that this is about helping people make philanthropic gifts. That comes first, that's foremost, it's the only thing that it's about. And that if we let ourselves get sidetracked, we're going to lead our donors astray. We're going to create problems for our institutions. So every conversation really needs to focus on what would you, Ms. Donor, like to accomplish with your philanthropic dollars? Now, let's figure out the very best way to do that. Harvey really sort of formed my moral guideposts, I think, for fundraising.
You helped start some of these councils. Tell me about that experience.
Well, the Minnesota Council, I'd be hard put to put a year on it. It must have been 73. Started literally as a breakfast club around a table for 8. And that was literally all of us in the Twin Cities who were involved in plan giving at the time. One of the trust companies, pretty regularly there was a trust officer there, but it was mostly just fundraisers. Minnesota grew more quickly because I don't remember all the genealogy, but the Lutheran Church split and then reformed, and part of it had been headquartered in the Twin Cities and moved to Chicago. And as a result, they had an annual conference that was sort of up for grabs. And this breakfast group said, well, we'll take that on. We were foolish and didn't know what we were doing, but that was the beginning of the Minnesota Plan Giving Conference. It had been going on for several years before that under the auspices of the church. And that really was the beginning of the Minnesota Plan Giving Council. Fast forward 6 or 8 years, with support of the Lilly Endowment, the National Committee on Plan Giving was starting to get organized. And our council was one of the early components of the National Committee on Plan Giving. And from there, it's taken off.
Yeah, I bet that's been fascinating to watch the growth of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it has. It has. Some of the early resistance to, we called them allied professionals at the time. We didn't really mean that in a disrespectful way, but now in hindsight, that really does smack of second-class citizen. You know, you and your money are welcome here, but we don't really want you to be at the table with us. There were arguments about whether or not they should even be a part of the council. In the end, I think wisely we relented and agreed that, you know what, we're all working in the same field. We're talking to some of the same people. You may call the individual that I'm calling a donor, you may call a client, but that's because your business is different than mine, and that individual is better off if you and I are talking to each other. I think it evolved in the right way. I think it headed in the right direction.
That's interesting to hear because now it's like, what can we do to get our financial advisors and the state attorneys at the table more? And that it was a discussion of if they should even be at the table originally is very fascinating.
It was, and part of what changed is in those early years, those of us who worked for organizations, for charities, there was a good chance we knew more about these tools than the professional advisors did. You know, for lawyers, if you said, and I worked for a law school early in my career, I never went to law school. But if I said to a lawyer, charitable remainder trust, they nodded knowingly and said, I understand all about trusts. I had trusts and estates in my second year law school, and I don't need to know any more about it. Well, you know, a charitable remainder trust, a little different. But now that knowledge is ubiquitous. They're well versed in that. And in a way, they don't really need us the way that they did 30 years ago.
Can you tell me about the most fun or interesting gift that you've worked on?
Do I have to limit it to just one? Can I tell two or three or six?
Maybe not six, but like the top three would be great.
Okay. And again, I'm going to try to use first names and sort of generic institutions because I don't want to reveal things inadvertently. And I'll limit it to two. One, a pretty modest gift, and one, a rather large gift. I was working for a public university, and one day the bursar's office called, and they called the development office, just the main number. And I took the call, and they wanted to know if we were aware that there was a fellow named Arthur who was pretty regularly paying the tuition for three undergraduates. He was apparently just writing a check to the bursar's office to cover these three undergraduate tuitions. He'd been doing this for some number of years, and they were always from the same small town in a rural part of the state. Well, we looked high and low. We couldn't find anything about this guy. We didn't know who he was. But we had an address, and I reached out, and on my next visit to that part of the country, I sat down with Arthur and his wife, Audrey. And it turns out that Arthur was a college dropout. He had been forced out of the university at the beginning of the Great Depression because he couldn't get student financial aid. Shortly after he left college, he wanted to marry his high school sweetheart, but Audrey was his first cousin, and that was illegal in the state at the time. So to hear Arthur tell it, they hit the rails in the depths of the Depression and went to a state where cousins were allowed to marry one another and spent most of the Depression bumming around the country, and in the process discovered they really had a passion for photography and art and built for themselves a pretty reasonable commercial art business. back in Chicago. Anyway, so it was an easy first step to talk to Arthur about, you got the right idea, but there's a better way to do this, and you can get a tax advantage if you make a contribution to our foundation. You won't be able to select the students. Turns out he wasn't doing that anyway. He was just calling up the high school and saying, who's going to the university? So he started making his contributions to a real scholarship fund. Over the last decade or so of their lives, they made several life income gifts, charitable gift annuities, and eventually endowed the scholarship from their estate. And those scholarships go on today for this little school in a rural part of the state because Arthur just had the right idea.
Wow.
Interesting guy. Not a big gift. I mean, 6 figures or so, but not $1 million gift by any stretch. I think the lesson for me is that was a guy who was totally philanthropic. All he wanted to do is help somebody so that they wouldn't have to face the same hurdles that he had to face. That he was able to get a charitable deduction, that was icing on the cake. That didn't have anything to do with why he wanted to make those gifts. Fascinating guy. The other one I can think of is much larger, pretty well into the 8 figures, and a little bit of a darker story. Howard is the guy's name. He graduated from a professional program and moved away almost immediately and got involved in what is now the assisted living industry, started building these kinds of facilities. And as a result, Howard was involved in some pretty substantial real estate transactions. And he would always talk about some unsavory characters that he had to deal with over the course of his lifetime, of his career. I never really pushed. I didn't really want to know what he meant by that, frankly. But his plan was to leave a significant endowment for his program at the university. It was several $1 million. It was going to be really good for this program. So I helped him, worked with his lawyer. He wrote his will. We got a copy of it. There were errors in the will. The will referred to the school of his discipline. Well, it was actually a department within a college at the university. So I got in touch with the lawyer, and they were working on getting that corrected when suddenly Howard died. He dropped dead on a golf course. There was an autopsy. It was a subdural hematoma, probably caused by a blow to the head. There was a homicide investigation, went on for some time. Nothing ever came of it. Then someone came out of the woodwork, a woman who insisted that Howard was the father of her child, and there were claims against the estate. Anyway, it took a couple of years for the estate to finally distribute. And then when the money came to the campus, a fight ensued on the campus between the department and the college, because Howard had written this will, and the will said the school of the discipline. And the college said clearly he meant this to go to the college, and the department said, no, you didn't even know who this guy was. Clearly he meant for it to go to us. You work at a university, you know how these things work out. In the end, the university agreed that 5/12 would go to the college and 7/12 would go to the department. For whatever reason, they thought that fraction was equitable. I've always been a bit haunted. Had I done a bit more to document the errors in the will and Howard's real intentions, maybe had him send us a letter or sign something, I might have avoided that. I know in my heart, Howard intended for it all to go to his department. It was just one word that he got wrong. And I have always felt badly about that. And I don't really want to know what happened on the golf course that day, because Howard, as he said, he dealt with some unsavory characters.
Both of those stories are fascinating, but I'm thinking especially now about the Howard one and how I know at our university, part of the reason why we have to do such detailed contact reports after every visit is because of that issue that you just said that ended up in the 7/12 and 5/12. Like that probably would have been in one of our contact reports at some point, and I'm just assuming that this was before most contact reports were digitally inputted. Those issues hopefully can be resolved, but it's also making me think that there's probably training that we need to do for our major gift officers when they're in these conversations to make sure that they're being explicit. It's to this part of the department at some point in the conversation trail because you don't want those fights to happen over, is it the school, is it the college, is it the department, those things.
Yeah, I think so. And you're right. It was all paper back then, but even so, I should have had the presence of mind and I could have written it for him to have Howard send us a letter saying, no, here's what I mean, and we'll get my will fixed. I think that alone would have been enough to, there still would have been the mess with probating his estate and all of that, but at least at the university side, there would have been no doubt what he intended.
But that's taken care of with like an email nowadays, like a 2-second, one
Yeah,
line email saying,
not to digress, but under UPMIFA, you probably know any written instruction is a gift instrument, and that includes an email.
mm-hmm.
So you have to be careful on the other side too, because you can have a beautiful formal agreement and then upend it with a poorly worded email that you sent subsequently that now becomes binding on this carefully crafted agreement. I do think we should be much more careful about what we put in writing. We all have a tendency to think, oh, it's just an email, it's just a text. These days, it's just a text. Well, that's all discoverable. I mean, I've worked for state institutions. I know what public disclosure laws are like. Literally every word is discoverable somehow, some way. I worry on two counts. I worry about some of the things that people put in those, and I worry about some of the things we don't put in, we don't make a record of. The documentarian, archivist, journalist in me wants all those details. I want to know what their house looked like, what the pictures were on the mantle. All of that is wonderful stuff. And some of our CRM systems, make you compress it so deeply that you lose all that wonderful intelligence that you could have.
That's a good point. Kind of the inverse of the fun, interesting gifts. Can you tell us about a time when you failed or something went sideways? And then how did you course correct? What did you learn from that?
It's another one of those where I have made so many mistakes. Here's my general learning from that. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to screw up. There's no doubt about it. The most important thing to do is to identify it and own it. Don't try to blame it on somebody else. Don't try to deny that if anything, take responsibility for it, even if you're not sure it's entirely your responsibility, because then you can get after fixing it. You can straighten it out. So I think I have always, I've always been more comfortable over owning my mistakes and trying to own them sooner so that we can pivot and start to fix it.
You've gone through a couple different roles. You were prospect researching and then gift planning and then managing consultant, working with PG Calc. As you've progressed through your career, how have you thought about each of those steps and what has kind of driven you to take each new version of your life and gift planning?
The move from prospect research to plan giving was pretty easy. I mean, as I said earlier, I was so enthusiastic about all of these things that I could now explain to people, and I really saw it as helping people make the very best gift possible. I think that's I think that's the heart and soul of plan giving. We really have we do things at a different pace than our colleagues in major gifts. We certainly do things in a different way than our friends in annual giving. But we really have an opportunity to learn what that donor is interested in, to learn about their dreams, and then to try to make those dreams come true. So that seemed natural to me. My moves after that, I was involved in plan giving until, well, I went to the commercial side for a while. This was back in it's about 1995 or 6. I went to work for US Bank and then US Trust and then Caspic and Company. And that was at a time when the financial services sector thought there was great profit to be made in providing services, but it was all new then. They weren't quite sure what these things were. Um, that was a wonderful period. It was about 8 or 10 years I spent on that side. And I think they have learned a lot, the financial services side. They're much more sensitive. They realize now that managing charitable funds is different than managing an investment portfolio or administering a trust. It's really unique work. But I was more comfortable getting back to the nonprofit side. Make no mistake about it, the financial services side is about shareholder value. And that doesn't get me excited in the morning. I'd much rather work with a donor. And then, sort of toward the end of my career, the last 10 years or so, it was roles mostly as a vice president, leading a team of, and I think that's a natural progression. You reach a certain point where you can be more effective if you're providing leadership to a team of field fundraisers. Even during that time, I missed it. I missed the opportunity to hit the road and, you have 4 calls scheduled in the day and one of them bombs out. And so then you've got this tertiary prospect who you don't really want to call on, but it turns out to be the best call of the entire trip. It's just serendipity.
Can you talk about leading a program and like the philosophy you bring as a vice president?
I don't know whether it's heresy or heterodoxy. I mean, one's a sin, the other isn't. So I guess it's a heterodox belief then. I'm not a big fan of these incredibly detailed metrics, and I have inherited staff that work that way. The metric is how many call reports did you file? I don't care. What I want to know is how many times did you get yourself in a position where you could talk to the donor about a gift, where you could present a gift proposal? You're going to have to make a whole bunch of calls in order to qualify. You're going to have to make a whole bunch of cultivation steps in order to get yourself to a position where you can talk seriously about your next gift. And that's what I care about. How many times in the year did you get yourself in that position? My experience has been fundraisers, even major gift fundraisers, work much better if they're focused that way. If the only metric is how many call reports did you file, you'll get a lot of call reports. But they're likely to be calls on people who are willing to take the call. Not necessarily the best prospects, not necessarily the ones that were a little difficult, because it becomes a numbers game. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking about we recently went through kind of a revamp of how we were going to do our context and that metric and the focus that then goes into hitting that goal above the other stuff that you're doing because it's the metric that I have to hit so that I can have my end of year progress be what it needs to be.
Yeah, it does. And sometimes, you're just chasing the numbers. And I don't think it makes sense. Don't get me wrong. I think you keep track of the number of call reports you file because it's a good diagnostic. If you're making way more calls than the average and not succeeding, then maybe we need to do some training and backstopping how you're making those calls. There could be something we need to work on there. Or if you are making a great number of proposals, then none of them are getting funded. Maybe you're overshooting. Maybe we need to lower the sights a little bit. So all of those measurements are important, but I really do worry about number of calls being the key metric. And I see it, we're in an automated world. CRMs are very good at counting the number of transactions, but that's not always the way that plan giving works.
Right. Any other information you wish the world knew about you?
Wow, can you make that question any broader so that
No, not at all. As broad as possible to get you to talk.
so here's as I was getting ready for this, I was thinking about Conrad Teitel and Harvey DeVries and two very different approaches. Teitel is the consummate technician, and what I learned from him is you got to know the stuff. It's not that you can't bluff it. Bluffing is good, but you really have to know it and be able to explain it to people. They're going to trust what you tell them. Harvey, on the other hand, preached the importance of not getting seduced by these bright, shiny objects that we have. And as I thought that through, I think donors segregate themselves into three categories broadly. There are what I would call transactional donors. These are, and this is most donors, and I don't mean transactional as in, ooh, and I got a table at the benefit. I mean transactional as in, I'm going to make a gift to you and you're going to do some good work. So I think of the television commercials showing the abused pets, dogs. That's a transactional gift. I'm going to give you $100 and you're going to stop that poor dog from suffering. Much of fundraising is focused, it seems to me, is focused on transactional donors. We're going to do good work. Give us your money. We're going to do good work. The challenge is you have to reinvent that relationship every single time. You got to prove that you did it and then make the case all over again. The very best donors, some of the people that I talked about, Arthur and Audrey, those are transformational donors. They want to affect lasting change. And it almost doesn't matter to them how much it costs. I mean, in some cases, you've got to be careful that they don't give you more than they should. They are that committed to it. And we all wish we had more transformational donors. There's a third category that I hadn't thought of till I started going through this. And I think those are, I guess I would call them instrumental donors. That's a word that Harvey DeVries used to use. They give for the financial benefits. I was on a call recently with a planner, and the opening salvo was, my client needs one of those CRTs. We've already had the wealth replacement policy issued, and now we need the CRT because that's the final piece of the plan. Well, that's a totally instrumental donor. And the challenge with instrumental donors is if the stock market goes up or down, they disappear. If the tax law changes, they disappear. They're not giving out of a sense of philanthropy. They're giving because it's an instrument of their financial and tax plan. They used to be a small fraction of what we dealt with. I really worry that they're becoming a bigger piece of the pie. You know, we used to call it deferred giving. Then we started calling it planned giving. That's probably better. Planned sounds better than deferred. Now, these days, we almost exclusively call it charitable gift planning. The emphasis is on planning, not on giving. And I don't know where that takes us. And you asked me to think broadly. So as we look at things like legislative affairs, are we inadvertently painting a picture that this isn't really about philanthropy? This is really about finances and taxes. And if it's about finances and taxes, then do we lump it in with other federal expenditures? Do we treat it like any other tax advantage? If so, we should budget for it differently. We should stop things. So I don't know that the world is well served by this overemphasis on the instruments of gift planning. I think it would be better if we got back to, let's talk about that question that I said half an hour ago. What would you like to do with your money that would be meaningful to you? Let's figure out the best way to do that. But let's answer that first question first and not immediately jump into, we've had the wealth replacement policy issued. Now we need the CRT to complete the plan. Because that's the bridge is out if we're headed down those tracks.
Yeah. And I guess kind of tie it all back together. That's what the importance of making sure that our financial advisors and wealth advisors and attorneys are part of our conversation at the table so that we're not getting that after they've set the plan in place.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah. And if I go around the table and sit on the side the planner was sitting, that's not an unreasonable approach for him to take. He's creating a carefully crafted financial plan, and a key component is a charitable remainder trust. The charity, the philanthropic part of it, that's totally fungible in his mind. He just needs this piece of the puzzle. And as the charity representative, I'm there to provide that piece of the puzzle. So there's nothing wrong with him. He's not doing anything bad.
Right.
He's just coming at it from a completely different perspective than I am.
And I guess that explains also why you said you didn't like being that side of the table as much as you like the fundraising side of the table.
Yeah, I've often wondered it might be a good idea for all of us who are plan giving officers for charities to go work on the financial services side for a couple of years to get a feel for it. I mean, it is often commission driven. It is certainly deadline driven. You want to talk about metrics. They have metrics that are totally unforgiving. They may be better compensated than we are, but they're taking bigger risks than we are every day. So I think we would be well off to appreciate that.
All right. And then final question for you. Who in your phone do you want to hear on this podcast?
Yeah, I thought about some of the early folks who were involved, and I may have contact information for some of these. Chris Yates is another interesting fellow. He was at Caltech and then at Stanford for a while, and I think he's still working, but I don't know where. He was involved when NCPG transitioned to Partnership for Philanthropic Planning. He was a key player then. The other person who has a wonderfully contrarian point of view sometimes is a guy named Jeff Comfort. Jeff was at Georgetown for years and years and then moved to Oregon State, I think, and has since retired. Jeff did some of the early work on the Quest valuation standards. That was largely Jeff's work. And might be interesting to catch up with him now that he's been retired for 2 or 3 years now that he's got some perspective on it, and just see what he thinks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you for joining us on Dead Giveaway, where every gift tells a story. A huge thank you to Craig Wruck for sharing his incredible journey. Join us next month when we sit down with Brantley Boyette, founder of Giving Docs. None of this would be possible without my amazing producer, Jessica Hall, and the support of the entire National Association of Charitable Gift Planner staff. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please share the show and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening to Dead Giveaway, where generosity lives on.